I like reading aloud sometimes, and I really wanted to read this. I guess I'll start with reading something, but this is a good one. I love Alan Watts. So this is just a random. It's the greatest ASMR. When you're just listening to someone, sometimes you get lost in their voice. We've got this hang up about life being divided into two parts. There are the things we do, and then there are the things that happen to us. For this reason, Westerners have a habit of misunderstanding karma and talk about it as if the awful thing that happened to a person are the punishment for bad behavior enacted in some previous life. That's nonsense. Karma simply means your doing or your action. It's not some type of punishment passively received from an external source. If you were to understand karma and recognize that whatever happens to you is actually your own doing, then it's never bad karma. It's only truly bad karma if you refuse to admit that it's your own doing. For example, if you blame someone or something else for it, or speak of karma as if it's something mysteriously happening to you. So what does that have to do with our Western notion of the law of nature? Consider that we have been told that God's commandment is the foundation for everything that happens in the world today. At the same time, contemporary science promotes an entirely new idea about the law of nature, which asserts that these so-called laws are not things that exist in any real sense. You can clearly see that the universe is doing all of this stuff. But what we have been calling laws depends entirely on these human brains that are oriented to make sense of it all. One of the ways we make sense of it all is by the principle of regularity, something quite important to us. Take a clock, for example. A clock ticks regularly. The world does not. Inconveniently enough, the earth does not go around the sun neatly in a precise 360 days. A fact that has irritated calendar makers throughout the ages. How do you make a rational calendar? You can't. There isn't an obvious solution because the rotation of the earth upon its own axis does not neatly synchronize with its rotation around the sun. So there's always something a little odd and wobbly about it. But that doesn't stop us from superimposing that ideal figure of a circle with its 360 degrees over a rather odd elliptical path. Doing so is the same thing as placing a ruler upon a piece of wood and saying this piece of wood can be cut to 12 inches. Now, inches are something that exists in the wood itself. Inches are simply a method, a technique that some human invented for measuring things. And so we can cut a piece of cloth or a trunk of a tree to so many feet. Originally, we compared that tree trunk with our bodies. This trunk is so many of our feet long, or so many spans of what we use our hands. And the inches is, of course, roughly the length of one of our finger joints. Our bodies typically have a regular shape to them, 5 fingers on a hand, 10 toes altogether. And for stretching ourselves out and applying that regularity to nature, we believe we could measure it. This is precisely the type of measurement we find when it comes to our law of nature. A law of nature is exactly the same kind of thing that is a ruler. It's a way of thinking that enables us to control our environment by observing what we perceive as regularities. Applying a calculus, a betting that the environment will be just as regular next time, and the odds are that it may be. If the environment does something once in a particular way, it's likely to do it again in a similar fashion. And that's how people were first able to predict things such as solar eclipses and the phases of the moon. They measured them, counting how often such and such as a thing did this, and how often and such a thing did that. What happens if you can make these kinds of predictions? To other people, we haven't yet figured it out. It seems like magic. It can even appear as if nature itself is obeying your command. All you have to do is announce that the moon is going to change at a particular time. Say it so many days from now it's going to take a crescent shape, and the people will think you're actually making it happen. In this way, some predictions establish people in privileged positions simply because they were able to foretell change. This is what I'm getting at when I say that the laws of nature are established by the human network. We project the lines of celestial latitude and longitude on the sky, but those lines don't actually exist in the heavens. They're simply a way for us to measure the positions of the stars, which are upon closer examination scattered all over the place in a way that would otherwise be somewhat confusing. Just try to remember that mess up there and figure it out. So some clever someone decided to overlay a spherical network on the sky in accordance with the principle of a circle, 360 degrees. That makes a nice regular network of squares that you can number. But the network itself has never really been there, see? And neither have the shapes. This collection of big stars looks like a dipper, and that array over there looks like a belt, and one over there looks somewhat like a cross, and there's one over there to the left that by extreme wrangling can be made to look like a virgin. All these imaginary lines that seem to join the constellations together are our ways of projecting a pattern upon this great and glorious confusion so that we can remember it and chart it. But it's obvious that if you looked at these collections of stars from some completely different position in the galaxy, all of those constellations and arrangements would vanish. You'd have to invent a new ones because this is nowhere static where the stars actually are. It all depends on where you're looking from. This is how we figure out nature with our extraordinary symmetrical brains. It is we who introduce the law into the world. We invent it. The word invent is Latin, means to discover. But we don't discover something that's out there. When we invent the law of nature, what we are discovering is something about ourselves. Namely, our own passion for regularity, for prediction, and for keeping things under control. Everything in context. Let's return to the billiards analogy. When you watch someone play the game of billiards, the cue hits the first ball, and that ball moves and hits another ball, which in turn moves and strikes another, and so on. You can observe the sequence and explain the behavior of the final ball that drops into the pocket. In casual terms, the action is a chain of rational events that began with the strike of the cue. This is precisely how most of people today view the world, as something that occurs via the mechanical processes of cause and effect. They might admit that the large picture is quite complicated, but would still argue that if one could know and track all the factors involved, you'd uncover that any behavior or singular act is ineluctable result of a series of balls bouncing against each other, and that fundamental atom or atomic particles predisposed a particular event to occur just as it did. Technically, that is known as a catenary relationship. This is how we believe atoms work, in the same way as when we line up a row of dominoes or bricks, knock the first one down, and then watch as the others all fall down in turn. That's a catenary sequence. Am I saying that catenary? Catenary. However, it has become increasingly obvious to physicians and biologists that this will not do as a sufficient description of how various events affect each other. There's a much different way of describing relationships. The word reticulate comes from the Latin word meaning net or net-like. Applied to relationships, reticulation means that we cannot ascribe any given event to one or more previous events in a causal chain, but that the relationship between the past and the present, as well as between the present and the future, has to be taken into consideration before we actually understand any given event. Let's say I drop a ball and it bounces. Now, this might actually be considered multiple events, but for the sake of argument, let's just call it one. I could say that I let the ball go. It obeyed a particular law of nature known as gravity, and it subsequently hit the floor. And because it was made of rubber and had some air inside, it bounced back into the air and slightly disobeyed gravity for a moment or two. But it's not enough just to describe the historical sequence of events that led to the ball bouncing as if it were a series of causes and effects laid out on a string along a line of time. In actuality, everything depends upon a present context. The density of air, to begin with. All kinds of things must coexist in order for me to drop the ball in the first place, much less everything and everyone that goes into manufacturing such a toy. In this way, whatever happens must not be considered merely as a historical phenomenon. It must also be considered in context. The whole notion of the thing or an isolated event in nature is purely abstract idea that does not fit the facts of nature at all. Most of us know that context is terribly important. It isn't just when a thing happens that's important. It's where it happens. That is, in what setting. The blood in the veins is in a serious setting, is in a certain setting, but in a test tube, it's in a completely different setting. My blood does not behave in a test tube the same way it behaves while in my body. It isn't the same thing. Similarly, we behave one way in a particular social setting and quite differently in another. When I was a child, I was one boy. When I was at home with my parents, a different boy. When I was with my aunt and uncle, and quite a different boy entirely. When I was with my peers, I changed accordingly to the setting I found myself in, as do most other children and adults. In spite of this, we're told that we're supposed to be one consistent person, even though we're not. As we grow up, it's drummed into our head that we should have a consistent character. Just as a character in a novel is supposed to remain consistent throughout the narrative in order to come across as believable, we behave the same way all of the time, doing so across various circumstances and in the company of various people, doesn't mean you're consistent. It means you've become rigid and inflexible. Everything depends on the context in which it is found. Anything we single out depends on its network relationship to everything else that's going on. In fact, the whole notion of a thing or an isolated event in nature, as well as the notion of causal relationships between different things and events, is purely abstract idea that does not fit the facts of nature at all. In nature, there are no separate events. Nothing happens in isolation. Not touching your head, not holding someone else's hand, not looking at the stars, not breathing, nothing. Of course, you can see all sorts of wiggles happening around you, all sorts of colors and all sorts of shapes and forms. But none of them are actually separate things. We speak of inside and outside as distinct, but we cannot truly separate them. Try doing that with your skin. It takes the outside and the inside working together to create this whole skin situation in the first place. No outside, no inside. It's the same way we breathe. The physical situation of my body inhaling and exhaling is impossible without the external situation of there being air to breathe. You can't see air, but it's always around, so you don't pay much attention to it unless it changes rapidly, as in the case of a gale. And you can point out that change to someone else, that sudden wiggling going on out there, and say, hey, look at that. And they'll know what you mean by that, because of that is something at the end of a finger point. That's different and peculiar from other things. From that process comes the idea of an isolated event or a thing. It's a that. But all of these that's that are happening aren't disconnected. They go with each other. My inside goes with my outside. My breathing goes with the air. And this whole situation of you reading or listening to these words in this moment is a complicated going withness. Going withness. This is the fundamental idea I'm speaking of here. The idea of going with. From this idea, we can start to construct and understand the whole notion of networks, the principles of which are difficult to understand, especially for those of us brought up speaking Western languages and thinking in Western terms. That being said, it's possible for us to think of networks through the lenses of relativity and relationship. Let's say you're sitting there being exactly the sort of person you are. Maybe a little neurotic, maybe a little happy, maybe a little sick physically, maybe a little ashamed of yourself for one reason or another. You're simply sitting there being however you're being, just the way you are. Whatever that's like for you, whatever your personal situation is, that experience goes with the entire situation of the rest of the universe. Back goes with front, inside goes with outside, and whatever you are going with, the way the whole of the rest of the boundless being is arranged. Now you might think that it's the way that the boundless being is arranged that determines what you are. Or conversely, you might believe that you are what determines the structure or patterns of the larger universe. Either you did it or it did you. I'll discuss that in more detail later. For now, I'll just say that the argument of that dichotomy is ridiculous. It isn't a question of what controls what. It all goes together. You and the universe are one event. As Pierre Teilhard de Chardin famously writes in The Phenomenon of Man, the whole universe is the only true atom. In other words, the universe is the only true and indivisible whole. I consider it personally non-duality. It's particularly hard for Westerners to grasp this idea. One reason it's difficult for us to understand that everything we are goes with the rest of the universe, and that we're given conflicting messages about who we are. On one hand, we're supposed to be one consistent person. On the other, we're also supposed to improve and change. For one reason or the other, we're supposed to be different or better than we actually are. We repeat this message to one another. We get the same idea from television, and we're bombarded with all sorts of advertisements saying the same thing. The world is full nowadays of people making a living from their systems that show us how to grow, to evolve, to change in a particular direction. All for a fee, of course. They all say some version of, look here, I've got this important program or school, and you really should come and study with me. The system might not originally be theirs. It might actually belong to some famous sage or pundit or all sorts of spiritual authority they know. What it doesn't matter in the end. What matters is that you recognize that you're supposed to change, which means you enact a particular course of study, which means that you pay. I've been given all sorts of opinions about what I'm supposed to do with my life. For example, what I need to do in order to get myself into shape. A half hour of yoga practice, an hour of zazen, exercises to help my memory, a special diet to make sure I get proper nutrition, and so on. If I followed all of the advice I received, I'd spend my entire day doing things in the name of getting prepared for life. And when I think it through, I think, my God, the whole damn project just isn't worth it. We've received subtle versions of these messages, of course. Some experts will tell us to just pick one thing. You're getting confused, they say. Narrow it down and focus on one thing. And if you're not sure what one thing to choose, they'll be sure to inform you about which one they think is best and right for you. This is precisely how people get drawn in and sewn up by religious fanatics. They get shown the proper way, whatever that is supposed to be. I want to be clear, I'm not offering anything of the sort. I have no intention of selling you a system or program. I don't have any magic recipes that involves, say, something special for you to do every morning for 5 minutes or so. My whole intention here is to help set you free from all of that. Ideally, you only attend one seminar or read just one book and never have to come back to me again. It's not the best business model, but as far as my livelihood is concerned, there are always more people out there foolish enough to pay attention to me. It shouldn't be about me anyways. It's about you. And you are like a dewdrop suspended on a multi-dimensional spider's web in the light of early morning. But if you look at that dewdrop closely, you'll see that it reflects every other dewdrop there is. And the way that one drop looks goes with the way that the others appear. See? They even have their peculiar glimmer, depending on their peculiar position in the cosmos, and the reflection of the whole web in each drop of dew is slightly different. Nevertheless, the whole network, that is, all of the drops together, depends on each individual dewdrop, just as an individual dewdrop depends on all of the other dewdrops. So that's the situation we're living in. the mutuality can affront our logic at first, because although we might understand how we depend on the universe, after all, we need sunlight and air and water and parents and all that kind of things, it's a lot more difficult to see how the universe depends on us. We fail to learn that the relationship of the network is entirely mutual. It runs both ways. It depends on you just as much as you depend on it. It's your brain that turns vibrations of air into sound. It's you that turns whatever the sun does into light. It's you that makes the air's activity in the sky into the color called blue. Blue doesn't exist on its own. There's only blue in your brain. If you hit a drum and the drum doesn't have any skin, it won't make any sound. It's the skin that evokes the noise out of a moving hand or drumstick. No skin, no noise. Just as the dewdrop reflects everything else on the web, you affect everything that goes on in the universe. By the constitution of what kind of reflector you are, you invoke what we call sun, moon, and stars. Nebulous even. Space itself is only vast in relation to you. Vastness means nothing on its own. It requires your participation and perception. From other perspectives, the space between stars could be minuscule, or the space between two hairs on your arms could be incredibly vast. Again, the core principle I want to get across here is the idea of going with. The universe around you is your outside just as much as the organs inside your skin are your inside. You go with the universe in the same way that the stalk goes with the root, or the pistil with the stamen, or the North Pole with the South. The principle of relationship governs everything. Actually, I shouldn't say governs. Sometimes we have to use wretched terms just to approximate what we mean. Perhaps underlies is a better choice. Relationship underlies everything. I want to repeat that the larger universe doesn't control or determine the smaller individual any more than the smaller individual actuates the larger universe. It's not a question of control. It's a question of dancing. It's a question of what happens rather than what makes it happen. Things aren't made to happen. You can only think that way if you insist that a certain event is quite separate, and that you can argue that the consequence of events that came before it made it happen in such and such a way. But in doing so, you'd have to ignore the importance of context. If you realize that everything is part of one event, that everything is a different aspect or phase of the same event, then you understand that is simply happening. You don't see anything make it happen. As the Taoist said, everything is interrelatable, and therefore we can observe patterns in the activity of the whole. There's an order to it, the order of the net. Each square or knot of the net is involved in maintaining the larger order. Each knitted stitch holds the whole thing together. If one starts to go, the whole thing begins to unravel. Buddhism teaches that everything mutually interpenetrates everything else, and even Christianity has the symbol of the Holy Trinity with 3 interlocking rings. Take one of those rings away and the symbol loses its meaning. A given planet or star seems to move and operate on its own, but its behavior only makes sense when you examine the larger situation of interdependence. If there were only one star in the whole universe, no motion could be ascribed to it. It couldn't even be to stand still. Nobody could tell what it was doing because there wouldn't be anything for it to relate to. But if there were two stars, we might observe them getting closer or farther away from each other. Although we wouldn't be able to tell which of them was moving, we need 3 stars to make a judgment about that. 2 of them might be closer together than the other one, which would make it seem like it was moving far from the pair. But maybe the 2 were moving away in unison. It's either, hey, we don't like you, we're getting out of here. Or, hey, why don't you like me? Why do you keep moving away? How would we be able to tell who's right? We need a 4th star, as in umpire. 2 stars can only move in a straight line with respect to each other. 3 stars can move in a plane with respect to each other. It takes another star to establish an objective dimension. But then there's a new argument. Which of them is the 4th star? Anything that is part of the functioning of the whole is legitimate. So that's the basic principle on which the whole universe is construction. Motion depends on comparison with something that remains relatively still. There can't be any motion without comparison. In this way, every single individual implies everything else that's going on in the universe. With lasers, you can photograph a small fragment of any photographic negative, and from that tiny fragment, reconstruct the larger picture from which it was taken. Because the crystalline tensions in that given fragment imply the whole context of crystalline tensions that belong to that particular negative. In exactly the same way, you as an individual imply the world, and the world mutually implies you. You are a natural formation. You are not determined by the universe. You move in and with it as harmonious as waves upon the ocean, as leaves upon a tree, as clouds in the sky. We don't accuse the clouds of making aesthetic mistakes. Seen in the same light, all human beings are perfect forms of nature. You may have fashionable discriminations about who is beautiful and who is ugly. You may have metaphysical discriminations about who is sick and who is healthy. And you may have moral discriminations about who is good and who is evil. But these are all points of views. Relative points of views, anything that is part of the functioning of the whole is legitimate. Therefore, even your relative points of views are legitimate as they too as a part of nature. The key is to live on multiple levels at once. If you can do that, you'll find there are no mistakes. Everything moves in accordance with the Tao, the way of nature. And if you're close to that basic feeling, you'll always be sane. At the same time, you can also choose to participate in a more restricted point of view within things are either good or bad. Just as in any given room, we can say that there is an up direction as well as a down. But you'd also know that in any area, there is no actual up and down. The terms are merely relative. These 2 points of views don't contradict one another. However, if one only take the discriminatory point of view, that is, that there's a fundamental difference between good and evil, you'll come away with a Christian hang-up. That basic difference leads to the construction of an eternal heaven and an eternal hell. And the distinction between the two couldn't be more radical. And the result of that belief is a disease called chronic guilt, which is one of the most destructive emotions that anybody could have. You end up feeling like an outcast from the universe, at odds with the reality and God himself. This makes people quite mad. and it's responsible for a good deal of the craziness of Western civilization. That's not to say that there isn't an important distinction between good and evil. It's just that the distinction isn't fundamentally important in the bigger picture. You have to learn to admit varying degrees of importance. You can't just say that because a certain distinction isn't absolute, it isn't important. After all, your own physical formation isn't absolute, but it's clearly important. You have a psychophysical organism. At the same time, you are something that the whole cosmos is doing. For the most part, I consider modern astrology to be pseudoscience. But there is significant truth in the practice of drawing a map of a person's soul that correlates to a map of the universe. It might be a crude picture, but it's the design of that person's individuality. Your soul is something that contains your body. Your body doesn't have your soul inside it like some kind of spook. The whole cosmos is your soul. The cosmos is doing you at the point you call here and now. Reciprocally, you are doing the universe. One depends upon the other. As Westerners, we have difficulty holding these differing ideas simultaneously because we have been brainwashed by several centuries of two contrasting put-down theories of our nature. On the other hand, we've been informed that we are wretched, disobedient, little subjects of an eternal king. On the other, we're told that we're simply a fortuitous congress of atoms in a mindless mechanism of incredible vastness. Having entertained those two theories for so long, we are unable to see that we and the universe are mutually causative, or, to use the Chinese expression, mutually arising. What we mean by intelligence. There's a significant hurdle for the average Westerner whose common sense and views of the universe is derived from the philosophies and scientific thought predominant in the 19th century. On the other hand, the organization of the universe was said to be intelligent, reflecting the dominant theism that presented God anthropomorphically as an old gentleman in the sky with whiskers. On the other hand, we were informed that God was dead beyond recall. What does this mean in terms of an intelligent universe? Let's begin with the word intelligent, which is difficult enough to describe. It's like the word love. It seems like we all know what it means, but we just tried to define it. It's the same thing with the term time and space. Now, there are certain elements of intelligence that most of us would agree to. We would probably include complexity as an element, with the understanding that complexity is an orderly arrangement of different clusters of intricacy. But that gets us into another bind. What do we mean by orderly? Are we indicating with that particular word that everything is in order, as if intelligently arranged? We use a lot of words that are imprecise. We recognize them when they appear, but we're not quite sure what they mean, and we just let it go at that. What if we begin with the pure hypothesis that ourselves are intelligent? We might as well make that assumption, because if we are not intelligent, then nothing is. So continuing on, for the sake of argument, we'll say that we human beings are actually intelligent. Now, if that is the case, then it follows that environment in which we live must also be intelligent because we are symptoms of that environment. One goes with the other. You would have a most difficult time convincing me that intelligent symptoms are possible in an unintelligent organization. We belong to this world. We didn't arrive here from somewhere else. We're not tourists in this universe. We are expressions of it, just as branches or fruit are expressions of trees. You won't find intelligent organisms living in unintelligent environments anywhere. The environment in which we live is a system of mutual cooperation among various organisms. A vast complexity of different kinds of organisms and the total balance of all of that makes your life possible. Front to back, human life goes with an extremely complex bacteriological world that occasionally diseases us, but the most part assists us with its colonies, societies, and methods of reproduction. Our blood and veins and bones and intestines and all of that depends on that world. That's just like at the bacteriological level. The world of insects is also extremely important to us. If we speak with an educated entomologist, they will scare the wits out of you because they'll reveal a number of conclusive reasons why the insects will ultimately take over the world. In the meantime, we're not absolutely dominated by flies because there are enough spiders to go around. And then there are also birds and flowers to consider. Birds and insects are mutually necessary to each other, as are flowers and insects, especially the bees. They might look quite different, but from one point of view, you could say that insects and bees are different aspects of the same organism because you can't have one without the other. Into the interdependent mix, throw into the complexities of atmospheric qualities and so on, and you quickly realize that what you call your body and brain are utterly involved in this network of all kinds of organisms. You don't find chicken eggs without hens, nor do you see hens without eggs. A hen is in one way an egg's way of becoming more hens and eggs. It all goes together. But Westerners have trouble seeing this because we are primarily invested in using an analytical method of perception that spotlights particular features of the world. Furthermore, we only give names and symbols to the features of the world that we consider significant. And there are many features of the world that we outright ignore. Young children point out and ask, "What is that?" But we can't answer them unless we recognize what they're noticing and considering it important. What's the word for dry space? What do we call the inside surface of a tube? Why do the Inuits have different names for snow and Aztecs employed only one for snow, rain, hail, ice, and so on? Naming those things we consider important means isolating those things as separate entities. But they're only separate in a purely theoretical way, and just because we say so. They're not actually materially or physically separate. It is immensely important that we become aware of this fact, because when we aren't aware of it, we do the most stupid things. We try to solve problems by attacking the symptoms of those problems. As in the case of our attempts to abolish mosquitoes. We forget that mosquitoes go without a certain kind of environment. And when we kill all of the mosquitoes, we change that environment. For example, we end up killing the other creatures that depend on mosquitoes for their existence. For the same reason, before injecting human organism with drugs or altering it with certain operations, you must study the body in great detail or risk bringing about unpredictable and unfavorable consequences. We must also thoroughly understand the ecology of an area before farming, and we can readily see that not doing so has appalling results. And in order to become our characteristic sense of hostility to the external world and stop conquering nature with the bulldozers and space with rockets, we have to realize that the universe is just as much ourselves as our own bodies are. We have an inside body and an outside body, and the two are inseparable. This inseparability should give every technologist pause, because you probably shouldn't go run into a particular situation with penicillin and DDT and what have you, because how do you know when to stop? Without knowing it, you could be discriminating against a surplus of given aspect, such crickets or stomach flora, and will subsequently have to build the population up again or risk the consequences. This is why the Taoists teach Wu Wei. It means something like non-interference, especially when it comes to nature and politics. It's almost like our concept of laissez-faire, but not quite, because the Taoists understand that acting upon nature is unavoidable. You can't actually isolate yourself from the world. You interfere with something with every breath you take. The art of Wu Wei is that when you do interfere, you endeavor to do so by going with the grain. If you want to split wood, split it with the grain. If someone attacks you, use judo. The other person's violence will bring about their downfall. Similarly, sailing is very Wu Wei, whereas rowing typically isn't. Unlike what transpired in the West, the Taoist views of the cosmos as a vast universe organism without a boss. In Chinese philosophy, there isn't anyone out there making the world happen or ordering it to do so. There's no central principle in the middle and nothing that sends out commands to all of its subordinate parts. Instead, the thing intelligently organizes itself. What would you change if you were God? This is the principle of Zaran, which means self-so, or what is so of itself. For Taoists, the whole universe is a self-so, self-regulating organism, and the individual is not merely a part of that larger organism, but an expression of the whole thing. And as I've mentioned elsewhere, the whole depends on this particular expression just as much as the expression depends upon the whole. The Japanese term Jijimudge addresses this principle of mutual interpenetrations, it's penetrating. Well, but you see, when we look at the larger whole, it remains a bit of a puzzle. We come up with all sorts of objections to call it intelligent. We can think of a number of improvements we'd like to make, as if by some conscious science we could just reconstruct the universe and remove the need for mosquitoes or reorganize the human body in a more optical way. It goes without saying that adding our improvements would result in other consequences, and we likely wouldn't enjoy all of them. Hence the saying, be careful what you wish for. What would you change if you were God? What kind of universe would you design? Really think it through sometime. I strongly believe that if you went through the trouble of modeling your own universe and seeing what comes of it, you'd eventually settle on the exact model we have now. All of these fundamental principles, vibration, energy, the yin-yang, balance of negative and positive elements, make up this model, which is incredible. Even so, we have difficulty seeing the universe as an intelligent organism. Physicists have made maps to describe the behavior of nuclei that include rotating particles or wavicles. They look more mathematical than a living organism because we expect an organism to look sort of gooey with flesh and blood and so on. If you just look through a microscope, you might not see the organism. But when you look out the other way at the rest of the universe, here we are, as if sitting down and moving around on one of those electrons. One of the reasons it's difficult for us to formulate the idea that there is an intelligence operating here is because all we're capable of seeing is a fireworks display. The big show of radioactive molten gas, so much escapes our conscious inspection, and we can't see the total design. So we make the mistake of viewing the universe as a contraption of sorts and think of ourselves as something that just happened to arrive upon it by accident. It's funny that we can put ourselves down by saying we're just an accident, a kind of chemical accident that has occurred on an unimportant rock that orbits a lesser star on the fringe of a minor galaxy. And that's supposed to be us, floating around in a universe that doesn't give a damn about us. At the same time, this wretched little chemical accident is capable of reflecting an image of the whole vast cosmos inside its tiny head. And is aware that it is doing so. So we are small in dimension, but vast in comprehension. Which one of those aspects is more important? If we are capable of seeing, that is, from a strictly scientific point of view, that an individual organism goes with an environment, bees with flowers, flowers with grubs, grubs with birds, and so on, then how could we define ourselves as merely that which occurs inside our skin? Everything that goes on within our body goes with everything happening outside of it, thereby constructing a single complex field of diversified behaviors and processes. Even when you look at it just from a physical point of view, the network becomes obvious. But reading books on ecology and botany and zoology and astronomy and physics and so on will only result in a type of theoretical realization of what I'm talking about. By itself, that type of realization won't take us very far. Specifically, it won't have all that moi effect on how we live from day to day. That level of change requires a knowledge of a more emotionally compelling nature. If we want to change the way we act with respect to our environment, for example, to prevent ourselves from continually to destroy it as we are currently doing, then we need a lot more than just theoretical knowledge.